She saw the government man's wagon a full mile out before it reached the gate, which was the thing about Saskatchewan. There was nothing between you and what was coming for 2 miles in any direction, and the land made sure you had time to sit with whatever it was. She was splitting kindling in the yard when she saw it. She kept on. The axe had been behaving well that morning, and she was not going to let a stranger from the land's office interrupt a good run of it. He came out from the barn and stood at the fence rail, watching the same horizon she'd been watching, the way he watched everything. Flat, unhurried, a man who had already made his plans around the weather and was not particularly surprised by any of it. "That'll be McCrae," he said Tuesday or Wednesday. "It's Wednesday," she said. He looked at her a moment, then back at the wagon. "Fence lines in good shape." "Books are in good shape too," she said. "I went over them last night." He nodded once and went back to the barn, and she set the axe back into the block and gathered the kindling into the box, and the wagon came on across the flat at its own pace with a thin trail of August dust folding out behind it. 4 years since she'd arrived on the CPR colonist car out of Winnipeg, in a coach that smelled of coal smoke and other people's children. She had sat with her bag between her feet for 2 full days and watched the country change past the window, the boreal bush thinning out and then gone, and then the prairie opening up all at once like a room you hadn't known was there, that enormous indifferent sky pressing down on the land as far as she could see in any direction. She had grown up with hills at her back. Nova Scotia always gave you something to stand behind. Here there was nothing. Nothing but grass and sky, and the particular exposure of your own outline against both of them. She had thought, "I am either going to love this or it is going to kill me." She had been right about both. The settlement agency in Borden had a list chalked on a board inside the door. Domestic positions, schoolteacher needed, laundress for the hotel up in Battleford. She had read teaching in Truro, but her father's farm had pulled her back before she'd finished. And then her father had died, and the farm had been sold off against what he'd borrowed. And her cousin in Winnipeg had written to say, "Come west. They need women who aren't afraid of the work." And she had packed what she had and come. The room was full of women the morning she arrived. She stood near the back. She had learned by her mid-20s to stand near the back, where the tallness of her was less immediately a thing anyone had to deal with. She had broad shoulders from 10 years of real farm work, and she had never once in her life been the first woman a man's eyes found in a room. And she had made her peace with that, which was a different thing from liking it. She watched the men come in. She watched them look at the women near the front, the small, neat ones with the careful hair. She watched them make their decisions in the first 3 seconds, the way men did, the way she had watched men do since she was old enough to understand what they were looking at and that she was not it. He came in later than the others. Dust-ospen coat, hat worn down at the brim from years of honest use. He was not a large man, but he moved like someone who had decided where he was going and was not particularly interested in opinions about the route. He walked the length of the room without stopping and then stopped in front of her, which she had not expected. He looked at her the way you look at a piece of equipment you are trying to honestly evaluate. "You come from farming," he said. "From a farm," she said. "My father's. I ran most of it the last 5 years." "Mixed operation?" "Cattle and hay, some grain. He kept bees." He took that in. "Can you drive a team, keep a set of books, work a full day through July?" She said yes to all 3, meaning it for 2 of them, and her face didn't change when she said it. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her hands. She did not put them away. "I don't need a pretty wife," he said then. "Not unkind. Just level, the way a man speaks when he is stating the conditions of a thing rather than apologizing for them. I need a capable one. Pretty doesn't get a quarter section proved up before the 3rd winter. I've got 2 years left on the homestead claim and I need someone who understands what that means." She waited for the sting of it and found it was not as deep as it might once have been. She had spent enough years being not the one they looked, and to have developed a kind of immunity to being told so plainly. The women nearest her had gone carefully still. She looked at him and said, "I can work. That's what I have." He nodded once, the small nod of a man closing a ledger. "Wagons outside. We go at noon." she had packed in 40 minutes. She had not cried. She had stepped into the flat afternoon light of a Saskatchewan August and thought, well, here is a thing. Let's see what it costs me. The house was smaller than she'd let herself imagine on the drive out. One main room, a lean-to kitchen, a sleeping loft with a ladder so steep she had to climb it sideways. The root cellar was deep and well dug, which told her someone had thought about the long term. The barn was in better repair than the house, which told her something about his priorities, which she filed away alongside the rest of it. He slept in the barn that first week. He had said he would on the wagon ride out. Said it the way he said things that weren't negotiable, just factually, as information. And she had been grateful in a way she would not have been able to explain to anyone who hadn't spent 2 days on a colonist car, agreeing to something she hadn't yet fully understood. She laid the fire that first evening herself, found the kindling in the lean-to and the matches on the shelf above the stove, exactly where a sensible person would leave them, and had the thing burning well before he came back in through the door. He stood in the doorway with his hat still on and his arms full and looked at the fire for a moment, the way a person looks at something they'd expected to have to do themselves and hadn't needed to. He didn't say anything about it. He put his boxes down on the table and went back out for another load. He made coffee the next morning before she came down. She found it on the back of the stove, still warm. 2 cups set out on the shelf beside the tin. He was already gone. She stood in the kitchen with the gray prairie light coming through the east window and looked at the second cup and let herself look at it the way you look at something before you decide what it means. She used 1 cup. She left the second. He came in at noon and said nothing about it. By the 3rd week, he had stopped setting out the second one, and she had noticed that too, the way you notice when someone stops holding their breath. Not a withdrawal, a settling. The distance between in case and no longer necessary. She had begun to understand by then that this was how he spoke, not in sentences, in what appeared and what didn't. When she was sick in February with the winter cold that laid her out flat for 4 days, she woke on the second morning to find her water jug filled and a second blanket on the foot of the bed, neither of which had been there the night before. She had heard nothing. He had come in the dark, in the deep cold, checked on her without waking her, and left without wanting credit for it. In March, the hay hook on her side of the barn was replaced with a shorter one without comment, after she'd mentioned once, weeks earlier, that the reach on the long one bothered her shoulder. In November of the first year, she came in from the garden to find new flint in the kitchen tinderbox. She had not known the old one was failing until it didn't, and then it had, and then it wasn't anymore. She filed all of it. She kept a ledger of it the way she kept the farm books, carefully with columns, without sentiment. She did not know what to do with the total, and so she kept adding to it and let the arithmetic accumulate. The near thing had happened in March of the second winter. A letter came from her sister Winifred in Pictou County. She read it twice at the table before she let herself understand what it was asking. Winifred's husband had come off a roof in January, and his back had not come back right. There were children. The oldest was 8. Could she come home? She sat with the letter for 2 days without mentioning it. She answered it on the 3rd day, telling Winifred she was coming, that she'd take the train east and help through the planting season. And she did not let herself think past that, because thinking past that meant thinking about what she would be leaving. And she had been telling herself for 2 years that there was nothing here she was attached to except the work. And she needed to keep telling herself that. She was halfway through filling her trunk when he came in from the upper field. He saw the trunk, he looked at her, he said nothing. She waited for a question, for an objection, for something she could answer or push back on or use to decide. She did not know what she wanted him to say. That not knowing was the problem. He crossed to the workbench along the wall. There was a length of harness she had been meaning to repair for 3 weeks. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and set it down in the center of the table, on top of the letter, so that his hands and the letter occupied the same space, and she could not look at one without the other. Then he went back outside. She stood in the room for a long time. Then she unpacked the trunk. She mended the harness. She wrote to Gladys McCavish, who was a sensible woman in Pictou, who would know what Winifred needed and who could get it, and she enclosed what cash she could spare and her address in Saskatchewan. She did not tell him, he did not ask. What she carried from it for a long time after was not the resolution but the moment before it, the harness on the table and his hands, and the fact that she had known, without being told, that he had put it there because he wanted her to stay and could not say so, and that she had wanted to stay and could not say so either, and that neither of them had needed to say so, and that this, in its way, was something. By the third year, the court orchard was starting to look like something that had been intended. The fence line ran clean along the north boundary. Post after post, she had helped set into ground that had fought them the whole way. Frost-heaved and stubborn, the kind of prairie clay that took 3 swings of a maul to get a post through. She had held the wire in January cold that split her lip and burned through her mittens. And he had said good tension there the way he said things he meant, like stating the weather, not like giving a gift. And she had taken it the way she took most things from him now, without comment, filed alongside the others. She kept the farm books in a large cloth-covered ledger from the store in town. He signed them when they needed signing and did not look over her shoulder. "You keep good books," he'd said in the second autumn, which was the most he'd ever said about it, and she had understood that as the sum total of a longer observation. "Numbers are just another kind of fence line," she had said, and he'd made a sound low in his throat that was close enough to a laugh that she counted it. She had stopped by then, asking herself whether she meant to stay. The question had dissolved the way questions do when the answer has already been living in you long enough to become simply the shape of the day. The fence was part of it. He had driven the last post in the north line the week after she'd said she'd see the year through, not before. She had noticed that, the way a thing had to be decided before the work of making it permanent could begin. She measured her life here in that fence the way another woman might measure it in other things. McCrae came in through the back door with mud on his boots and the particular self-satisfaction of a man who has confirmed what he expected to find. He was younger than she'd imagined. His coat was too good for August fieldwork, and his boots had been blacked recently, and he carried his papers in a leather case that did not belong in the same room as the kitchen table. She set out cups. He sat. He opened his case. He asked questions about the crop rotation, and she answered them, and he wrote the answers looking at the man across the table rather than at her, which she noted the way she noted everything, quietly and stored. He looked through the ledger she set in front of him. He turned the pages with a certain reluctance, the way a man handles evidence that is revising his understanding of something. He asked 2 questions about the columns and she answered both clearly, and he did not ask a third. He walked through the house after. She stayed at the table. Through the window she could see the fence line going north, the posts darkened with 3 seasons of weather, holding the straight line she had helped build into the ground. McCrae came back to the table in the expanded mood of a man who has found everything in order, and that mood made him want to say something generous. And what he said was this: "I'll be straight. This is a well-kept claim. Better than most I see at 4 years. Some men out here without the right kind of." He glanced at her, and the glance was the particular kind that decided things in the half-second before it landed. Without the right support behind them, the improvements fall short. "You've managed well, though. Whatever you've arranged here, it's working." The room went quiet. She looked at the ledger open in front of her. At 3 years of careful columns, crop yields and cattle counts, and the cold January entries where the numbers told the whole story of a hard winter without needing to explain it. She looked at her hands on the table, broad across the knuckles, a scar along the right index finger from the hay rake in the second summer. The broken nail she was always meaning to deal with. The hands of a woman who had split wood that morning and would split more tomorrow. She waited for the old feeling and found something different in its place. Not the absence of hurt, but the presence of something heavier and quieter than hurt. Something that had been building in the columns of a ledger for 3 years and knew its own weight now. She heard him set his cup down. My wife, he said, and his voice had gone to the particular register he used when he was driving a post into ground that needed to hold. Not loud, not hard, just certain. Has worked this claim as much as I have. She keeps the books and she reads the cattle 2 days before they need reading. And the north fence line is standing because she held wire through 2 Januaries while I drove posts. If this land proves up, it proves up because of her work alongside mine, not in spite of anything. McCrae cleared his throat, said something about no offense intended. She looked up. He was looking at her, not at the assessor, not at the papers, at her, the way he had looked at the fire on the first evening, and at the harness on the table in March, and at the fence line on the evening she had said she'd stay. The way a man looks at a thing he has decided to build his life around, even when he is not going to say so. And then, without theater, without needing the moment to be anything more than what it was, he reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Not a question, not a declaration, just the weight of his hand, flat and warm, over the back of hers, for exactly as long as it takes to say a true thing without saying it. She breathed once. She kept her eyes on his. The ledger was under her other hand, and the columns were still there, and the numbers still added up, and something in her chest had gone entirely, dangerously still, the way the prairie goes still before the weather turns. McCrae gathered his papers. The certificate would come through from Saskatoon before freeze-up, he said. The claim was in good order. He stood, shook hands, put on his hat, and went out through the back, and she heard the board creak under him, the step she had been meaning to mend since June, and then his wagon moving off down the trail. She sat with her hand on the table for a moment after he was gone. It looked the same as it always had. The scar, the broken nail, the particular coarseness of it that came from a life spent doing things rather than watching them be done. It did not look like a hand a man had covered with his own, in front of a stranger without being asked. She closed the ledger. She stood and cleared the cups and looked out the window at the fence line going north in the late afternoon light. He was already outside. She heard the barn door, heard the cattle settle, heard the small ordinary sounds of a working day closing out the way working days closed here. Not with anything said, only with the light going from copper to gray and the things that needed doing getting done. She started supper. He came in when the light was mostly gone. He hung his hat on the peg and looked at the kitchen in the way he looked at things that were holding, checking, confirming, finding everything where he'd left it. She put his cup on the table. He sat. Certificate before freeze-up, she said. That's fine, he said. She went back to the stove. The dog settled on the boards. Outside, the cattle were still in the near pasture, and the fence held its line north into the dark, the way it had held every day for 3 years, through frost that split the posts and melt that tested the footings and the long, dry falls that cracked the clay around the bases. She didn't need to go out and look at it. She already knew it was there. She put the supper on. He drank his tea, and the prairie dark came down over the quarter section the way it always did, slowly, completely, without apology, covering the fence and the barn and the trail where the wagon's wheel ruts were already beginning to fill with the first overnight dew, as if the day had happened and been decided and the land had no further comment to make about it. She had thought once, on the colonist car 2 days out of Winnipeg, watching the bush give way to open country, that a place like this would leave you nowhere to hide. She had been right about that too. She just hadn't known yet that she would stop wanting to.